Did Jesus promote pacifism? This was a question that came to me in a little different form, but I kind of rephrased the question. And I think that it's probably always a good question to revisit. Just to give you a little bit of definition, maybe some of you are saying, well, I don't know, what is pacifism? Let's figure out what that is first, and we'll see if he promoted it. Well, pacifism is the definition, is the thought that any form of violence is incompatible with the Christian faith. That's kind of the simplest definition that I could give you. In other words, there is never a place in a Christian's life where violence should be acceptable. And the people that would argue for this, they would say, well, Jesus was a pacifist. He certainly never, took up arms and never had violence with people. He taught his followers to do likewise. In many ways, they would look at Jesus much like the first century version of Gandhi, who would have promoted nonviolence in every way. And, it touches very close to home here because there are a number of groups that would promote this type of teaching. Most of your Anabaptist groups, like the Amish, like the Mennonites, like the Church of the Brethren, the Church of God, those would all be ones that would promote this type of teaching. Your Quakers and your Shakers from days gone by, and also cults like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. They would both argue for Jesus as a pacifist. And we're going to look at the arguments that, at least some of the key arguments that they would make, key passages they would turn to, and we're going to kind of unpack those tonight and see if we can get a complete 360-degree view of what Jesus' teaching was related to violence. The first passage that most of them will turn to is Matthew chapter 5, a classic teaching of Jesus here in Matthew 5, verses 38 and 39. Verse 38 and 39, Jesus here in the middle of his teaching, he says, "You have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." So there's the turn the other cheek. We all know that as the simple scenario here. Jesus taught us to turn the other cheek. If someone's doing evil to you, doing violence to you, and they hit you on the one side of the face, you turn and let them hit the other side too. And you don't try to retaliate. This is the teaching that you hear. Don't do an eye for an eye. It's not about you getting vengeance. It's not about you getting back at them. So they would say here, Jesus taught us to turn the other cheek. Then we see a little bit further down in this same passage, verses 43 and 44. What else does Jesus say about our enemies? He says, verse 43, "You have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." And then he goes on for verse 46, "If ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same?" And he goes on to give that example. So here's the idea of we always need to love our enemies. So turn the other cheek, love your enemies. Sounds very nonviolent, very much a pacifist. Let's turn to another passage in Matthew chapter 26. I'm just going to quickly kind of get through kind of some of the key ones, and of course you could go all through and deal with this in a more comprehensive way, but in the time we have tonight, we're just going to look at some of the key arguments. Matthew 26, verses 51 and 52. Jesus still teaching. It says, this was Jesus there in the garden. It says, "Behold, one of them which were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck a servant of the high priest and smote off his ear." We know from other passages this was who? Peter, right? Peter came a little too anxious to protect Jesus there before they took him to the cross. So he smote off one of the servants of the high priest's ear. 52 of the passage, Jesus said unto him, "Put up again thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." And so there's the adage that we've called today, If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. That's what we might call it today. That's what that passage came from. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Again, Jesus, is he teaching us never to take that sword and use it? Well, we're going to look at these a little more directly. Let's turn to one more passage, though. This one's a little bit more direct, and this is in Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. And Jesus is here with some soldiers. And the soldiers, it says, well, let's go back to verse 12. Then came also publicans to be baptized, and said unto him, Master, what shall we do? He said unto them, Exact no more than that which is appointed you. And the soldiers likewise demanded of him, saying, And what shall we do? And he said unto them, Do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. So here is kind of a direct argument to soldiers, no less, that says, do violence to no man. What is he saying here? What is the argument? And does this wrap up the arguments for pacifism? Well, let's go back and let's look at these a little bit further in a little deeper context, because I think with each one of these, when you see the greater context and the arguments being used here, you'll see that it's a little more complex than just the simplistic little adages that we sometimes use to talk about this in terms of turning the other cheek. Let's look at this one first. Matthew 5, 38 and 39. Here's turn the other cheek, and also the whole idea of loving your enemies. It's all found here in the same passage, 38 down through 48, if you want to go that far, where Jesus has his teaching on these types of things. Both of these are also found, by the way, in Luke chapter 6, verses 28 to 35. And this is the teaching that we're dealing with. What is he dealing with? He starts with verse 38. Ye have heard that it's been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What was the teaching that he was quoting here? Is teaching from the Torah, right? Teaching from the Old Testament, where you would say, hey, if somebody does something wrong to you, you need to pay him back, and you need to, do right by them and make the recompense back and forth, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. By the time Jesus' day came around, of course, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of the many years of Jewish rabbinical teaching had developed this whole theology around an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and it's got to be exact down to the tenth of an ounce if you steal something and you give it back. And there's a lot of very technical ways in which they were presenting this law to people at this point in time. And what does Jesus say in verse 39? He says, I say unto you, resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. But what does he continue? And if any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have your cloak also. Whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain or 2 miles. Give to him that asketh thee. From him that would borrow of thee, turn now not away. You've heard that it's been said, you shall love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do you see what Jesus is dealing with here? He's dealing with a question of giving certain types of people preferential treatment over others, or dealing also with personal retaliation. There's 2 particular issues he's dealing with. If someone is, attacking you in some physical way, he's saying, if you act out of anger or you act out of revenge to someone who's personally done you wrong, what leeway are you giving God to do his work? What leeway are you giving God to do the vengeance? Even the Old Testament says many times, vengeance is mine. I shall repay, saith the Lord, right? And a lot of times, what gets problems, what creates an escalation of problems? It's when one guy gets offended and he gets back at that person, and then they get back at that person, and then it keeps going back and forth, and then it continues to elevate on through there, right? I just was watching a documentary on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some of you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1961. Khrushchev, I'll give you the short version. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, brings a bunch of ballistic atomic missiles and places them in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. John F. Kennedy, who's our president at the time, finds out about this and begins to create a blockade. There's a lot of tension. They're literally within one button push away from making the biggest mistake in humanity's history. And in the end, they begin to back down. In the end, the Soviets remove their missiles, and the U.S. Basically removes their missiles from Turkey in exchange for it. And why was this? Why was this so important? Because in the midst of the Cold War, and I know the young people today don't understand what it means to grow up in the Cold War. I only grew up at the tail end of it. But there was a time when people were seriously afraid of completely annihilating the earth. I mean, nuclear weapons had the ability to literally annihilate everything living on the earth. And obviously the way it always played out was, well, whoever attacks someone first, well, that person's going to attack in response, and then you're going to send more missiles back in response to that, and it just keeps going back and forth until there's nothing left. That's the idea. Well, on a very much smaller scale, this is what Jesus is dealing with here. He's dealing with someone who says, hey, if you let this thing go, you're going to escalate the situation far beyond what it needs to be escalated, and you are in that course of escalating that, you are eliminating your ability to be a witness to that person as well. That's essentially what he's doing. He says, if somebody asks you to go a mile, go 2 miles. Why? That differentiates you as a Christian. He says, give to him that asks you, and from him that would borrow of you, turn not away. What does that giving attitude come from? It comes from a Christian mindset. He says, you've heard it said, thou shalt love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemies. Is this not the epitome of what Jesus did for us? Were we not his enemies when he went to the cross? Yeah, we don't often think of it that way. But we were dead in our trespasses and sins. We were the enemies of God's holiness. And Jesus said, I love them, and I'm going to die for them. And so we need to not do this retaliation amongst ourselves, because we're going to lose our ability to witness if we do this. And it's important to note, in terms of this turning the other cheek, that these are enemies that may have done you wrong, or they might not have. We just don't know. We just can't respond to every unkind thing that happens to us. It's not all about personal vengeance. The principle is this: personal offenses should not be retaliated with violence. And I think there is a truth here. Too often we get our dander worked up about somebody who does me wrong, and the next thing you know, we act out of our anger instead of out of truth and justice and objectivity. We lose that. And at the same time, we lose our ability to show God's love to these kind of people. Some people, really, they get under our skin. They're hard. They're hard to show love to. And you still have to do it. That's what we're called to do. But it's not dealing with violence in every way. It's dealing with violence related to personal retaliation. Let's look at the second passage, Matthew chapter 26. Got to keep moving quickly tonight. Matthew 26, we have this, again, the passage, live by the sword, die by the sword. Jesus is here. Peter sees the angry mob. He pulls out the sword, says, I'm going to protect Jesus. I'm going to whack off this guy's ear. I don't know whether he just had bad aim or maybe he had really good aim. I don't know. But nonetheless, he got the guy's ear, and that's it. And Jesus said, whoa, 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 whoa. Remember, paint the picture here of what Jesus is at. This is an angry mob, right? This is a mob that had just paid off Judas Iscariot in order to come and betray Jesus. This was the mob that was determined to come and take this Jesus and put him before this kangaroo trial that was ultimately going to put him to the cross. This was the end. This was the last moments of Jesus' ministry here on earth. And this was not a time that the disciples were going to win the fight. And so Jesus says to him, hey, put your sword away. Put again thy sword in his place. All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. I'm just going to give you my paraphrase to what Jesus was saying to Peter. Are you crazy? You're going to get yourself killed. You see this mob of people here? You get this sword out, you start waving it around, we're all going to get killed here. You know? This is essentially what Jesus was saying. These people were ready for violence, and you're here cutting this guy's ear off and only encouraging and inciting more violence. And this is not the time or the place. We have to be passive and resist, and not because it's just something for us to do, but because this was God's will, right? This was God's will that the disciples didn't, form a militia of some kind and try to take on the Sanhedrin at this point in time. It was God's will for Christ to go to the cross. And so he says in verse 53, actually, if you want to go down a little bit further in this passage, what does Jesus actually say? He says, thinkest thou that I cannot pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But then how shall the scriptures be fulfilled, that thus it must be? You see, Jesus is saying, he says, hey, put that sword away. If I want to do violence, I can call down enough violence to wipe all these people out. I can get all these angels down here to take care of all this. This angry mob's not a big deal for me. He says, but right now is not the time to do this. And this is what he's saying to Peter. In other words, there is a wrong time to be violent. Okay, so we see these principles. There is no reason to have violence in your personal retaliation. And there is a wrong time to be violent, maybe just for your own sense of logic and reason. In other words, know when you're outgunned and just keep the sword put away. This is the idea. Or maybe know when it's not God's will to do this. So this is the idea behind Matthew 26. Let's look at Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3 and verses 12 to 14. This again is in a context of Jesus' teaching where he begins in verse 12 dealing with the publicans. Jesus is talking to them and the publicans came to be baptized. Remember the publicans? They're the tax collectors, right? These are the guys that, they're not like tax collectors today. They weren't elected to office per se. They were ones that were more appointed by the Roman government, or they somehow bought their way into this position. And they used their power in a way to take advantage of people, right? It wasn't like, hey, fill out your tax form and give it back to the government, and these are the guys that are going to make it happen. No, it was, you come and talk to the tax collector, and he'll tell you what you owe. You don't know. You come to the tax collector at the end of the day or the end of the year, whenever it was, and they would say, I see you drove a Mercedes in today. I see you're wearing some pretty nice clothes today. I think you can afford to pay. And they might say, I'm going to charge you a little extra because you look like you can afford it. And maybe some of the other guys, they might give them a little break. And in the end, they told the Roman government, here's what you're going to get, and I get to pocket the rest. This was a business venture for these publicans. I remember years and years ago, my wife worked at the front desk of a hotel. I don't think they work this way today, but maybe it was. But she used to tell me, and I just shook my head in disbelief. She said when they trained her to be a front desk clerk, and this was in the days before the internet was where you booked your hotels or anything, she said they would train you to see what kind of car they drove in outside. And when they came to the front desk, you try to see how much you could charge them based on what you thought they could pay. And she said sometime, and it was like a game that they would play. It was like different front desk clerks. Well, I sold this room for $250 this tonight, and whatever it was. And it was always like this game to see who could charge the most for their particular room, because apparently, I guess it was allowed. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't allowed. But nonetheless, this is the same game the publicans were playing. It was always, how can I take advantage of somebody? What does Jesus address about the publicans here? He says, on verse 13, exact no more than that which is appointed to you. He's saying to the publicans, don't line your pockets. This isn't a game. This isn't about taking advantage of people. And then he turns to the soldiers. Verse 14, the soldiers likewise demanded of him and saying, what shall we do? And he says to them a couple of things here. Do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. So the publicans get this, hey, don't cheat people on their tax bills. Don't overcharge them. And he tells the soldiers, do no violence. So the soldiers, by definition, that's kind of their job, right? That's kind of what they do. They do violence. But the idea here is, behind this word, is not the idea of any type of violent act. It's the idea of it's to shake thoroughly is a word that you could use to this, to make someone tremble, to terrify someone, to extort someone, okay? In other words, don't be the kind of guy who takes the power and the authority that you have and the weapons that you have and use it to intimidate other people. Use it to get your own way with those people. Use it to make them afraid of you. People should not sit around and be in fear of the Roman army as they walk around. Don't do that kinds of things to people. This idea of doing violence, when he says that, he's saying, don't abuse your power for personal gain. That's essentially what he's saying to them. He says, don't accuse falsely. Don't accuse people falsely. You know that the Roman soldiers were considered very credible witnesses. So think about this. Well, I'm a Roman soldier. I get a paycheck from Rome, and I just witness a crime. And the guy comes up and says, hey, how much will it cost me to have you say you didn't see anything today? And the soldier says, well, you know, if I just had a few more coins in my pocket, I might not have seen anything, and this is kind of how they worked. Or they might come around to someone else and say, hey, you want some protection? Going to cost you protection. Think about the New York mob scene, right? They would go around to the businesses, right? And you say, you got to watch out for the mobsters. They might come and wreck your business, or they might come and break an arm, or you might end up with concrete shoes sometime in the bottom of the river. And you got to be careful of these guys, but you know what? I can protect you from them. You just got to pay your bill every month, right? They would go around, and that's what it was. It was a racket, right? That's what the whole idea of racketeering is all about. It was a racket, and that's how they made money. Roman soldiers, they did the same kinds of thing. They used their position and their power and their might and their authority to intimidate people, to extort money from people, to allow their witness to be bribed. And what does Jesus say? Don't do that. These are all related to that type of violence, to make people tremble before you and your position. So what's the principle? Don't threaten or extort or abuse your position of power to intimidate other people. So what does Jesus teach about using violence? We have a few minutes left. I want to just share a couple of really important key passages that do talk about Jesus' use of violence. And first is in John chapter 2. John chapter 2. And verse 13 to 16. It says, the Jews' Passover was at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, that's like a little whip, little handheld whip, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep, and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables. Now we know this classic picture of Jesus with the whip chasing the money changers out of the temple. And this is a classic scene. And the point that I want to make about this is, did Jesus use a form of violence here? Well, I would argue that he did. There are certain situations that I'm going to call that require physical aggression. For some reason, why did he have to use whips? Why didn't he just come up to them peacefully and say, I'm praying that you will leave this place and hopefully you won't be taking advantage of people or something like that? Why didn't he do that? Why didn't he go and just say, we're going to pray for these people today and pray that they might leave? Why is it that maybe he could have just stood up there in the midst of the money changers and gave his disciples a speech about doing the wrong thing and taking advantage of people and being these types of ne'er-do-wells that were there in the temple? Well, he didn't do those things. Because why? He knew, of course, in his perfect wisdom, the only way to get these people out of the temple, the only way to send them the message that they needed to hear in this particular situation was to be physically driven out of that place. He just knew at that point in time that was needed. Now, that's not to say that we have perfect wisdom, which is why, by the way, this has to be balanced with the principle we saw earlier that sometimes there's a wrong time and a wrong place for violence. But that doesn't mean that sometimes there isn't a right time, that we need to have physical aggression. Jesus certainly showed that. Luke 22, let's continue. Luke chapter 22. Luke 22 and verse 36. We kind of pick up the theme of living by the sword and dying by the sword here, but it's a little different idea. Luke 22 and verse 36 says, he's speaking to his disciples here as he's preparing them for ministry without him being here on earth, ministry after the cross. And he says to them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Jesus is saying, you're going to be out ministering for me, and I want you to be prepared. And there's a couple of things you need to have. You're going to need to have some money. You're going to need to have some food. There's not going to be people to provide for you. Remember, when he had his ministry, he sent those people out earlier, the disciples 2 by 2. And what did he tell them then? Well, you don't have to take anything with you, because people are going to provide for you all along the way, right? Then they came back. But now he's saying, I'm not going to be here anymore. People are going to be turned against you, and you're going to have to be prepared. Prepared for what? Prepared for your own needs, prepared with the money that you need, prepared with the food you need, and prepared with the personal protection that you need. He says, if you don't have a sword, he says, that's going to be more important than that extra set of clothes you're packing in the suitcase. That's what he's saying. He says, sell the garment that you have, because it's more important that you have some personal protection with you than that you have that extra set of clothes. This is very practical advice. He's saying that sometimes you may need to resort to violence for the sake of personal protection. Personal protection. This isn't the same idea as turning the other cheek. The life wasn't being threatened in this particular case. This isn't about personal aggression or personal retaliation for being done wrong. This is about people who've decided, I hate the cause of Christ. I hate what it is you're teaching, and I will do whatever I can to silence you. And at that point in time, these disciples needed personal protection. We've been working through the book of Acts. How many times did Paul have his life threatened by different people that came against him? Time and time and time again. And, we don't know how often he had to, either duck and cover or leave or get out of the city, but the truth is, he needed to have some personal protection. This is what Jesus had told them. He wanted his disciples to be equipped for self-defense. Jesus knew that the message of the gospel would be divisive and would create conflict, and that this would result in violence. Matthew 10, Jesus said this, "Think not that I am come to send peace on the earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes shall be they of his own household." He's saying, you're going to have deep, dark, ugly disagreements with some of the people that are closest to you over the cause of Christ. And you need to recognize it's not always going to be a peaceful message, peacefully received. And then finally, I want to leave with one other thought about Jesus' feelings on violence. And this one we have to turn to almost the end of the Bible, Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19, we see something about Jesus himself when he returns. When Jesus returns, what does he promise is going to come with him? Violence, conquering vindication. We see a picture of Jesus painted for us in Revelation 19 and verse 11. John looks up and he says, "I saw heaven open, and behold a white horse. He that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes are as a flame of fire. On his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood. His name is called the Word of God. And the armies," verse 14, "which were in heaven followed upon him, upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. Out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword." Why? "That with it he should smite the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. He shall treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and the wrath of Almighty God. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords." And of course, it keeps going down. Verse 21, "The remnant that were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh." Revelation paints a very bloody and violent scene here on the earth. And yes, some of it comes from tribulation, some of it comes from those judgments that God pours out upon all the earth, but it gets finished in person. When Jesus Christ comes, the sword coming out of his mouth, and all those who aren't on his side, they ultimately suffer that judgment. They suffer the violence. Jesus comes with that violence. You know, God's judgment on earth always comes with violence. Think of the stories that we even know in the Old Testament. Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Here was two cities that were steeped in sin, and God gives them time to repent and hopes that they would repent. And what does he have to do? In great violence, he destroys the cities with fire and brimstone. What about the flood? All the earth, people drowning. That's just a horrific scene. If you think about this, we always think about, oh, wasn't it nice? Noah and the animals and the giraffes are sticking out of the ark and all this fun stuff. And meanwhile, people are screaming and drowning and doing what they can because they don't know what to do. Asking to get in, and it's too late. That's violent. The flood. And what about the violence that was commanded to the nation of Israel when they were going to claim the promised land and they were told to root out these pagan nations and slay them by the sword? Those were commands that came from God. God did not ever say violence was a no-no. He just says that we have to use it judiciously. We have to use it not for retaliation, not as a means of vengeance, but there are times when we will need to have physical aggression. There are times when we might need personal protection. And we have to recognize that in the end, God's judgment will be full of violence. And we have to be ready for that as well. I think that's why I want to just leave you with this thought tonight from Ecclesiastes. And the writer there says this, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up." No, I don't think Jesus promotes pacifism. I think that he probably promotes more peace and pacifism than the world would agree to. The world loves to retaliate. The world loves to take vengeance into their own hands. The world loves to extort people and do those things that Jesus commanded them not to do, and use violence as a means of intimidation. And obviously, we're not called to do any of those things. But at the same time, there is a time and a place. It takes wisdom to know, but when God is in it, there's nothing wrong with it. And I think we need to be recognizing that Scripture does give room for violence when the need arises. But we need to pray that that never happens. Pray that we don't ever have to get in those situations where violence is called for, because that never ends up with a positive outcome.